All right, welcome everybody. We're here to talk about realizing infrastructure's resilience dividend. We've got a great panel here today, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a second, but briefly I'll introduce myself. My name is Tom Lewis. I'm from WSP. I am our business executive in charge of climate, resilience, and sustainable infrastructure. I'm also a board member of the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon already. Carlos Sanchez, Executive Director, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment and Initiative with leadership of the private sector dedicated to advanced solutions for resilient investments. But I will speak more about it in a little bit. Over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Freedom Kai Phillips. I'm the director of the Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress. I'm a legal research fellow with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law and a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. Pleasure to join you.
Good afternoon. I'm Ekoswehi Iyahen, the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum. And it's a public-private partnership really exploring how we can use the capabilities that exist within the industry to drive and support resilience building. So happy to be here.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Amit Prothi. I'm the Director General for the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It's a 2-year organization which has memberships from 31 countries with a secretariat in New Delhi, and we are promoting disaster resilient infrastructure across the globe.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. We broke this into basically 3 pillars, so we'll go through each pillar and we'll have questions for the panel on each. But before we do that, I just wanted to go over a few high-level kind of metrics, kind of set the table as to what is the resilience dividend. You can see on the slide here that the traditional approach to infrastructure looks at capital costs, and that's how people make decisions. And they look at the baseline projected costs, and then they make decisions on the value of the project and justifying the project only with that lens, of a capital cost lens. With the resilience dividend, the big difference is you take into account the fact that if you build an infrastructure element with higher level of resilience, it's more adapted to the changing climate, that you will actually realize a big benefit through avoided damages when future disasters or other impacts occur that you've now built the infrastructure against. And just a few kind of high-level metrics to give you the sense of the kind of the value of a resilience approach and this dividend that we're talking about. The World Bank and a few other organizations have done some nice reporting, and I'll just do a few sound bites from their reporting. Global energy capex is going to increase from $1.8 trillion per year to $2.6 trillion annually by 2050. There's a $15 trillion infrastructure gap that we have to meet by 2030. Critical infrastructure for society and business requires $90 trillion in funding or more. 42% of companies with a $10 billion market cap are already aligned with TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and over 60% of the world's 100 largest public companies support TCFD. Happy to say, including WSP in that. The $2.2 trillion ESG debt market that exists is projected to swell to as much as $11 trillion by 2025. Nature-positive transitions could generate up to $10 trillion in annual value and create 395 million jobs by 2030, aligning with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And getting back to the dividend, the World Bank talks about a 4-to-1 return on investment when you build resilient infrastructure, meaning that you get back $4 for every $1 you invest if the infrastructure is resilient. So it's a very compelling financial case, but we're going to drill into, with the panelists' insight, into all the other elements of the benefits and the dividend of resilience. So with that, Why don't we start with you, Carlos? I know you wanted to talk about how do you strategically integrate physical risks, climate risks, into investing, and I know you have a few slides, so why don't you kick us off?
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Tom, and indeed, also thank you for the support of WSP and many here. It's really special to have so many members and friends that are very supportive of the work of the coalition. But as you said, I would like to talk very briefly about what we consider means a strategic integration of physical climate risk in decision making. And indeed, that reference to the $4 against one investor is a beautiful entry point to that, because we took that as a little bit of the starting point and tried to analyze what does that mean. Is it $4 that an investor is internalizing as return? Or is it $4 of economic plus social plus ecosystem value? What is the time for that, for those $4? It's not the same, the $4 paid immediately than paying in 20 years. So the discounting of those $4 also play a role. But it's a very important starting point to start dissecting what is the value in investing in resilience. So if I can, sorry. Well, no, I can start speaking to it. So one of the things that in the coalition that, again, many members here, and is basically aiming to bring collaboration across industry sectors to advance a better integration of physical climate risk, and that integration is not penalizing the decision maker, that is rewarding the decision maker, which is one of the starting concerning points that we have, that we see a lot of penalization of resilience. But if we start with this, what we're starting to call a little bit of the framework for the integration of physical climate risk in decision making. So there is one axis that is time. And we need to start understanding that for those different decision makers, there are different durations and different times that are relevant. Then with that, we also have hazards. So there are different hazards, acute and chronic, that affect an investment direct or indirectly. And then what we believe is quite of a step forward is the notion of the transmission channels. I'm sorry, because there is some issues on formatting here, but I will be mostly speaking to it. So transmission channels are metrics that, when affected, result in a change in the potential decision for that decision maker. And I should say, broadly speaking, talking about government decision making. So we look very much at the use case of a Minister of Finance that seeks fiscal efficiency, fiscal space instead of fiscal constraint. And we look at a CIO, that a professional that is seeking valuation opportunities and value enhancing operations. So with that in mind, you have different transmission channels for an investor. So that is net present value, cost of capital, CapEx, OpEx, depreciation, and each of those beg for a very particular application. For a government, we are going to look at a sovereign bond yield. We are going to look at GDP. We are going to look at consumption. We're going to look at employment, interest rate. And those more direct or indirectly, but they all suffer a degree of exposure to physical climate risk. So, and actually for each of those, we are advancing solutions. So in the government solutions, work in partnership with the government of Jamaica in advancing a tool that allows the identification of what are the top interventions and the top investments that in Jamaica, dollar by dollar, unit of effort by unit of effort, maximize the protection of social ecosystem and economic value. And then in the investor solution side, we have the PICRAM, also developed in partnership with many here. There is a methodology for the integration of physical climate risk in cash flow modeling practices. So let's say that we have these two, and what we are doing is in a way showcasing how different approaches can result in different results. So the insurance approach, incredibly powerful, incredibly important, and we believe that part of any solution. But the insurance approach brings us to a one hazard, a time scale, and a certain manifestation of exposure. That needs to be complemented, ideally, with other considerations that really start delivering to those other decision makers and types of decision and investment that enhance that value, that net present value at the end of the day. So really aiming to go as far as possible into the comprehensive understanding of risk, hazard, transmission channels that affect that investment. So really making two very different cases. Let's call it the economic case to invest in resilience for a government and the financial case for an investor to enhance value. The other way of seeing this is with this, that it could be like an idealized J-curve, but the beauty of this graph here is that as compared to before, there was more a theoretical exercise. This represents what our findings in our work with the first set of case studies. So with a cost function, then we expect a projected performance and benefits down the road. What we are seeing is that the benefit function is really not covering what will be the realized. So CapEx, OpEx, depreciation, cost of capital, and revenues are not going to be meeting the projected expectations. What happens is that when advanced actors are seeing this and they want to take action, what they are experiencing is basically pushing the whole curve downward. So there is an increase in cost, but the rewarding benefit on the other side of the equation is limited if existent. So that is the tragedy here. That is that there is an element of penalization, and we have abundant empirical evidence from members that bring real cases of this being the case. What we are showcasing is there is an element of counterintuitive too, and that is that the real curve, so first of all, the cost function, the delta capex, is lesser than we anticipated. So one would expect that, yes, you're making it resilient, but at the cost of adding cement, concrete, and therefore, in a way, being more costly. But that is not the case, because once you start establishing a connection between that design component, that capex, and net present value, then you start exploring efficiency. So how the most cost efficiently I could improve the resilience of my asset and the cash flows. And therefore, what we are seeing is that for lesser of an additional cost, we have an improved performance over the lifetime of the asset. What we don't see here is what net present value will be higher. And that will be a function, of course, of the discount rate. But what we see, and is powerful, it is the trade-off. Is that relationship that before was not there. Tom, I think it may be good that I pause there, but thank you so much.
Very good. Yeah, thank you, Carlos. And so as Carlos said, that tends to address kind of the finance minister, governmental perspective. But maybe I'll move to you, Freedom Kai, you're coming from Deloitte, and thinking also about the private sector side. I talked about all the big companies, all the big stakes that are tied up in TCFD and resilience and being more adapted to the climate change. So when you talk to investors, could be governments too, but especially private investors, how do you frame this discussion of resilience and the benefit?
Thank you so much. So I think the first thing is reframing the lens, the paradigm that's used. So for DCSP, our position is that leaders, irrespective of the organization, private actors or government, need to be focusing on the challenges and areas of opportunity with a post-2030 lens, right? Where are the investments that you're going to be making now? What are their implications from that post-2030 state going forward? And that helps refine what technologies they should be looking to deploy, not to have any type of stranded assets, and being able to refine where, in particular, the technology that they're looking to leverage is either a transitionary technology or an end state technology. So one example that we had highlighted earlier this week, DCSP was able to bring together a range of climate advisors and experts for an intimate conversation. We had a great guest who provided some special insights. He was the special envoy for the German-Namibian Green Hydrogen Coalition. And what he highlighted was not a win situation, not a win-win situation, but actually a win-win-win-win situation. And this was where I thought really reframed the notion of investment towards a resilient infrastructure, but also with a very keen eye to positive sustainable development co-benefits. So the first win, of course, is the rapid expansion of green hydrogen in the region. So leveraging some key environmental factors, they're able to then generate a sustained supply of green hydrogen for the German market. So that's the first win, access to a sustainable supply chain. Then the second win is providing the Namibians with a sustained economic stream, right? This is embedding sustainable development. This is SDG 7 in actualization. The country now has access to an ongoing revenue stream. The third win is being able to prop up the country as a whole in terms of increasing rapidly access to clean energy. So being able to position Namibia potentially being the first country globally to have the totality of their energy stream provided through green sources. So that's the third win. And then the fourth win is the surplus of energy that's available. So only 60% of the energy that's going to be developed is going to actually be needed domestically. And currently, Namibia imports a significant portion of their energy sources from regional areas, in particular South Africa. And we know how some of these energy sources may be generated. So now, with this surplus, Namibia is able to actually become a net exporter of these green molecules, this green energy to the region, providing a transformative shift. So this is the win-win-win-win of being able to have a long view on your investment, being able to take a look at risk through this post-2030 lens, ensuring that sustainable development is not just an afterthought, but is actually embedded in your investment scheme, and really laying the foundations for financing the future that we're looking to actualize. None of these things are easy. Right? This is a mountain for us to climb. But in many ways, we've been here before. I remember when I'm raised with these types of challenges, a Latin phrase, which is inveniam veum e faceam. So it comes from Hannibal when he wanted to march his war elephants over the Alps, and his generals told him he was mad. And the phrase means, we shall either find a way or make one. So in many ways, what we are doing is crafting the future that we're looking to actualize, ensuring that sustainable development is not a thought just simply on paper, but is embedded in the actual practical application and is verified in terms of the benefits that we're looking to put in place, that the engagement with our regional partners is not something that is imbalanced, but is seen in a peer-to-peer relationship, and that the outcomes are looking to actualize their domestic priorities. I think that's resilience in many ways in action, and ensuring that the investment is both framed and put in place in a way that is Paris-aligned.
Thank you very much. So maybe we'll move to Amit, you next. How can risk assessments promote resilience, and what are its associated rewards in the context of changing climate and natural hazards?
Thanks. I think that's a very interesting question. And the reason I say that is I'm sitting in a part of the world where when you say resilience, people look at you funny, right? Because to be fair, we're sitting in the resilience hub, and when I rotate around here, I see people who I know. So we're a really, really, really small community, right? So to try to then bring it into a mainstream dialogue and bring it in spaces where, particularly where there is so much infrastructure yet to be built. I use this reference point for urbanization. India is going to be building something like 40 new Bombays. When you think of Bombay and you think of this megalopolis, this massive city, to accommodate the amount of people that are going to get urbanized just in India alone, we're building 20 new Bombays by 2050. So that's the scale of infrastructure we're talking about. And we all understand that the way we've been building infrastructure, we're locking in a lot of risks. Right? So if you come from an urban flooding background, we're building infrastructure in ways where we're actually contributing to the flood problem, not actually solving it. Right? So the perspective I bring is that, first we need to be able to understand how to integrate in the new patterns of development that we are going to have to see, because we have to, we are urbanizing, the amount of infrastructure that countries are building we need to shift the paradigm from old technologies, where everything is concrete based. You talk to anybody who's designing, infrastructure to protect coastal erosion, and the first answer that an engineer would provide is maybe a seawall, right? And then we bring that up into our calculations, and we say, well, coastal protection will cost us $100 million or whatever that number is because we've made an assumption that it's a concrete barrier, right? So how does one start to articulate to the people who are building that infrastructure, to the decision makers, that there are other ways of addressing those risks? So, starting off from an understanding of that risk, saying you're basically going to be building infrastructure. Here is the exposure layers based on good data and science. Here's the exposure layer where your infrastructure is going to get exposed to certain kinds of risks. Here is how that infrastructure could be vulnerable. And here is how you need to then look at alternate technologies. So when you talk about nature-based solutions, and for the same coastal barrier example, if you can factor in mangroves, for example, with seawall, you've probably reduced your cost tremendously, and you've provided a resilience dividend of providing livelihoods. You're doing still, coastal protection was the main goal. You're still providing coastal protection, but now you've added livelihood opportunities, you included biodiversity, and you basically expanded the purpose of that infrastructure. So where we are trying to push the agenda is saying, we have to move away from these single-purpose infrastructure decisions to multi-purpose infrastructure decisions. And that's not easy because, we are training our cadre of designers, planners, engineers to think in a certain way where they're automatically going to the same solution of the concrete barrier. Our codes are written in a certain way, where again, they're pointing to the same place of a concrete barrier. So we have to go back and say, how do we train the new generation to say, you need to think beyond just one way of solving problems. How do we write codes which are saying, you're looking at performance and not here is the solution to address that challenge. Yeah? So all of this, when you talk about risk, to me, when I think about risk, I'm also thinking beyond the risk metrics to understand the infrastructure that needs to be built has to provide because we've got so much to build. We've got such a huge gap across the world in the amount of infrastructure that's needed that we can't just use that infrastructure for a single purpose. We have to think of it from a resilience dividend perspective. So, there's lots of work to be done in this space, but in my mind, if we can start with the articulation of risk and take it all the way down to understanding multi-purpose infrastructure, hopefully we'll reach that resilience dividend that we're looking for.
Thank you. So we've hit the first pillar, which was the risk assessment, hit the second pillar, which is making the case for resilience. So let's now move to the third pillar, which is capacity building of the stakeholders that need to be involved to make resilient infrastructure, resilient investments happen. So why don't we start with Ikoswehi? What role can the private sector, specifically insurance industry, as an example, play in this? And what do you see as the benefits or incentives for such engagement?
Thank you for the great question and all the interventions. I think they've probably touched on some of the answers to that. But I really liked Amit's response in terms of context matters, right? And we're in a context where, developing countries, because that's why I will speak from the perspective from, there are huge investments going into infrastructure. A lot of that is not protected, right? Extremely vulnerable when you think about climate change. And then when you think about where we are and the conversations around adaptation finance and resilience and the infrastructure associated with that, there is a need to be proactive about thinking about, with this new kind of adaptation infrastructure that we need, as Amit had mentioned, how are we actually thinking about the exposure associated with that, the risks associated with that, but also the protection of these critical assets? So from my perspective, I think that the insurance industry can play a really critical role here. First is in terms of putting a price on risk, right? And that's important to the point that you raised in terms of incentives. And the incentives that you send to individuals, to companies, but also to governments. And incentives are also important because it is also a way to subtly, if I can say that, shape public policy around how people treat to risk. I can give an example from the Caribbean where there was an island that wanted to, after a hurricane had passed, they wanted to significant damage to utilities, electrical utilities, which are poles, right? And they went to seek funding for, reconstruction, and they could put these utilities underground, right? That would be the logical, resilient response. But the cost of that is extremely prohibitive, right? And so the question is, why aren't they rewarded, right, for trying to deploy a resilient strategy that could take them into the future, right? Why aren't we thinking about the infrastructure investments that we're making and rewarding those governments that want to do things, people that want to do positive things? And I think that the insurance industry can play a critical role in putting a price to that. And what is the cost of not being resilient as well, right? There's also a conversation there to be had. The second is, furthermore, we talk about when these events occur, disasters occur, and I'm contextualizing it because we are here in Egypt and talking about climate change, the kind of financing that is available to support recovery efforts. Insurance is about financial protection, right? It's about how do you put resources aside before an event occurs so that if something were to occur, you actually have something that you can draw on. The reality is that most people in the world do not have access to the kind of coverage that you see in most developed markets, right? And I will keep emphasizing this point of 2 to 7% in terms of insurance penetration rates. That's huge, massive exposures. Huge inability to actually access resources when something occurs. They don't have the money to invest in infrastructure. The infrastructure that's there extremely exposed, right? And then the financing after is also an issue. And so insurers have a role that I think is critical in filling that gap, in working with governments to understand those exposures, but also provide very practical financial tools to address some of these issues. And I think that one of the things that we don't often talk about in this space is that when you think about the losses that we see globally, apart from government kind of responding, the most significant chunk of funding that goes to support intervention is from the industry, right? They're the biggest contributor to financing for recovery. And we need to scale that up in ways that are unimaginable, given the reality of what we are seeing with climate change. But a third point that I think that is also important is that these tools that exist within the industry come with considerable analytical work to underpin that. And that information database is actually what we need at this point in terms of risk understanding. How do we use that information to make critical decisions? How do we use that information to balance the conversations between governments, development partners, with the multilateral banks in order to, again, set the right incentives? And I think that we are at a point where it's great to see the industry so well represented and being present in this space in Glasgow and having coalitions such as the idea for engagement with the CCRI as well as the CDRI, because there is an urgency to this work, right? And you have an industry that is focused on risk and wants to engage with the public sector and has to actually, in interest of both parties, to try and work out solutions. So for me, the benefits are better understanding of risk, financial protection, better risk management, and also the opportunity in very practical ways to leverage private sector. We talk a lot about that, but we don't see enough of it. And we have an opportunity with the insurance industry. So those are my responses.
Very good. And I couldn't agree with you more about the private sector. And so let's maybe pull on that thread a little more. I'll stick with you, Ekeswe. What do you see as the major challenges for the private sector to engage? And can you give some examples from experience maybe of public-private partnerships, investments that had a good impact in supporting greater resilience in communities?
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge that I see within our space is a greater understanding of the need for ex-ante financing instruments and insurance. I think that there is often a bit of a I will dare say, and my insurance colleagues are in the room and might look at me, insurance colleagues, it's a loaded word, right? But we are talking about the thinking around that, right? Let's get past the word, right? Which is, how are we preparing for what is inevitable in terms of huge shocks? How are we thinking about preparing financing? How are we thinking about the investments that we're making in terms of resilience? And oftentimes there isn't, I think naturally people don't want to think about these unfortunate situations, right? When we think about COVID, it's something that we knew, the industry was talking about it for a while, but people didn't really think it could happen, right? And look at what has occurred. It's the same thing with climate change. And we're in a context where, again, when we think about the COVID experience, only 2% of financing was prearranged for response. When you think about disasters, climate-driven disasters, the figures are not that much better, right? So there's a need to deepen understanding, a need to deepen, I think, the technical work to support the availability of better tools, more innovation in that space, because what might work in London might not work in Mumbai, right? And I think a better focus on protection. Who do we want to protect? How can we protect these people? What are the tools that we need? What is the conversation that we need to be having between the public sector and the private sector in order to make sure that this is in place? And again, I keep saying this word urgency, so it's education, it's innovation, it's boldness, it's courage as well, right? So being willing to step out of your comfort zone to engage with non-traditional partners to craft new solutions. And I think that we are at a point where people need that. There's a stalemate in the negotiations across the room, right? And this is the space that offers a chance for open thinking, right? Open thinking around ideas and also scaling ideas in radical ways that we'd never thought about before. So for me, I think that those are some of the investments that we are prepared to make within the IDF, and we've launched a number of programs focused on that, a Global Risk Modeling Alliance, where industry is working with the public sector, the V20 group of countries, to really work on this issue of deepening risk analytic capabilities. And then there are other programs that we are working on with the United Nations Development Program and the German government to have conversations with governments directly on the kinds of solutions that they need. If it's insuring public schools or hospitals in Peru, or providing coverage for smallholder farmers in Mexico. It varies, context matters, but you have to be prepared to meet the challenge.
Very good. So we'll go back to Amit. There's a lot of talk, as there should be, at COP about global South and the incredible needs, the disproportionality of climate change and the impacts. So from your perspective, how are the major infrastructure systems undergoing the transition towards net zero, and how are they dealing with the capacity gaps, especially in the global South, with the particular challenges?
So, I just want to paraphrase that the organization I lead is mostly focused on risks. It's the adaptation narrative that I like to promote. So, in the net zero space, I think the transitions that are happening, we see that as an opportunity because it's a fast-growing industry. The codes and the risks, the codes are not locked in. So if we can figure out ways, when we are trying to do that, is where we start to work with the transitioning industries, whether it's solar, wind, hydrogen, hydropower, right? Hydropower exists, but there are climate risks coming there as well, right? So if we can figure out ways, and we are trying that, where we start to get them to be better informed. Somebody used a very interesting example yesterday. There was an airport in one part of the world, I won't name the place, which was very proud of being completely dependent on solar. Okay, very proud. It was all in their marketing materials. They got hit by a flood. And where were the solar panels? In the floodplain. Right? It happened again the next year. So suddenly, an airport which is incredibly proud of being completely solar now is relying on other energy sources to be more secure in their energy system, right? So I use that example only by saying that, because we are in a new new space, we have an opportunity to lock in newer kinds of information, less, understanding of risk. Because if we don't do that, And these new technologies, which are emerging technologies, which need to show promise, which need to succeed, if they fail for a variety of reasons, they're not achieving the net zero promises that they're making. Right? So for us, it's really looking at how do we introduce codes, data, information, understanding in these newer technologies that are emerging. So that's really where we are trying to come into the net zero space.
Yeah, and maybe going back to you, Freedom Kai, your business is so broad. Yeah, maybe you could share a couple examples of putting resilience into practice that kind of tie in with all three of the pillars, any and all of the three pillars.
So I have a couple of examples of innovative finance approaches which I think have really cool outcomes. Cool is really the only way I can describe it. So the first is leveraging Article 6, the pilot scheme that the Japanese have rolled out. So this is the joint crediting mechanism. So what they've done is they've committed as a component of achieving their NDC, massive investment support to be able to enable the deployment of technologies across a range of jurisdictions. So they have partnerships in 17 jurisdictions. They help deploy energy efficient technologies, renewable energy technologies. These then generate credits that go back to Japan to help them achieve their NDC. So this helps provide access to capital, helps de-risk some of these new and evolving innovative technologies. It helps deploy them in terms of providing resilient infrastructure to developing and emerging spaces that are deeply in need. It helps actualize some of those capacity building elements, and it helps really focus on key SDGs such as SDG 7, SDG 13, SDG 15, and then a few others. One cool example is in Mongolia. So they put in energy efficient systems in terms of their ventilation, their overall operation of 3 hospitals, and then they put solar panels on the roof so that the hospitals now all run on 100% renewable energy. So you've now taken a region which had very limited access to sophisticated healthcare. You've put in place best of breed technologies with a future focused application. You've now propped up both the domestic infrastructure, you bring in the domestic partners in terms of the government and their industry, so now you have knowledge sharing across a range of actors, and you've increased access to professional healthcare in a significant way, particularly in an area where this is mostly needed. Another wonderful example is from Danone. So this is the Livelihoods Fund. They've now scaled to multiple funds. They have the Livelihoods 3 fund in partnership with Mars, so they're helping build livelihoods of smallholder farmers. But the original idea, which kind of spurred in 2008 in partnership with the Ramsar Convention and the IUCN, really came from some of the initial legal shifts. Right? As a EU-based entity, they needed to have a certain degree of compliance, disclosure, and then being able to, of course, align with the particular domestic legal framework in terms of carbon offset measures. Now, rather than going out of the market at 2008, of course, as I'm sure you recall, there was some concerns around some of the viability, the quality of some of the credits that were available. Rather than just simply purchasing what was affordable, or potentially what was cheap. What they did was pool their resources and invested in best of breed examples. So they then take these CDM projects and they scale them immensely. They wrap around those projects robust domestic capacity building. And one really wonderful example is called Oceanum, Project Oceanum. This is in Senegal. Now, you made a mention about mangroves. Great thing about mangroves is they have roughly a 28 to 100 time capacity in relation to an equivalent space of terrestrial forest in carbon sequestration. Project Oceanum engaged over 350 indigenous communities to reforest their mangroves. Now, what they ultimately did was reforest 10,000 hectares. Now, 10,000 hectares is just a number that you pull out of a hat. What does that mean? That's the equivalent size of Paris. Now, as a follow-up in 2016, they reached out to all of these communities to validate what the impact of this relationship was. And these investments aren't short-term, they're 25 years long. They teach the community how to do the monitoring, reporting, verification. It creates a circular income to the region. Now, outside of that, 80% of the communities that they reached out to recognized a fourfold impact in terms of their own household income. They had increased livelihoods opportunities in terms of the resilience of the overall ecosystem, access to clean food, access to cleaner water, and across the range of communities that they accessed, all of them noted how transformative that investment was. And that's just one example of a range that the Livelihoods Fund in their initial projection, let alone the second and third iterations, are looking to actualize. I think this type of vision, being able to say, we're not just going to simply do what is available, but we're going to design something that is best fit, that aligns with our mission, that allows us to actualize sustainable development in practice, is really the way that we're formulating these conversations amongst our private actors. They now have a range of actors from Hermes, SAP, Michelin, all participating in the Livelihoods Funds, and they're looking for their third iteration to be over 100 million euro. If we can replicate versions of this rather than just simply going for low-hanging fruit, I think this is where private actors can truly act as catalysts for sustainable progress.
All right, so we'll open it up in a minute to questions. So think in the audience here, if you have any questions, happy to take them in the remaining time we'll have. But while people are thinking, Carlos, maybe you can wrap us up. You talked about the Jamaica example, which is an amazing example. So maybe, could you just take a few minutes to pull more detail out of that and share in the context of all three pillars, including the stakeholder aspect of it, with particular examples of, that you think are noteworthy from the Jamaica experience the CCRI has had?
Delighted, and but if you allow me, I also like to reflect a little bit on the great remarks that have been brought to the table in terms of this transformation on the narrative, and I think that is the crucial element here to really showcase how resilience does not equal to costly, tedious, and unattractive decisions and investments that indeed needs to be rewarded, should be rewarded, and can be rewarded. And that is absolutely crucial in so many respects, and in delivering to all the stakeholders that we are listing here. And I don't think that there is an element of competition or false choice. There is these, to the most vulnerable communities, to economies, to nature, and to investors. And as compared to what it's been perceived in the past, there is those can be achieved together. So indeed, the work in Jamaica it's been a beautiful illustration of that, in starting with a very, let's say, tough exam question from the government, which is to an extent perfectly translatable to the exam question from the investor, and that is, I want to see this exercise as analytically rigorous, as wonderful, and as impressive as you can put it, and we trust it, but I want to see this resulting in benefit. So for the Minister of Finances, I want to see fiscal space. I don't want to see fiscal constraint. If you're going to come to me and going to say, look, this beautiful work, but where before you had a fiscal need of 5, now you have a fiscal need of 6. And wait a second, because then on top of that, you're going to have to relocate a unit from non-climate, where you know the political value, to climate. And wait, because I have a third piece, that is that you just need to wait a little bit to see the benefit of that. And that is where there is a lack of that. And I think that the work in Jamaica, but also PICRAM, are answering the need for an immediate and proportional reward and recognition of that exercise. And indeed, I'm very happy that Jim Hall is in the room, representing the University of Oxford, that they have absolutely championed the first phase of the work. And maybe just to summarize the work in Jamaica, what we are doing is implementing a 4-phase approach. So basically, starting with the leading work of Jim and the Environment and Change Institute at the University of Oxford in advancing the visualization, measurement, and location of where the largest concentrations of economic, social, ecosystem value at risk are within an infrastructure network. So bringing leading expertise in network modeling, in climate risk analytics, to really go beyond an arithmetic addition of asset value at risk, to go to understand what is the dependence of people, economies, and nature on assets. Crucial first step, and I would say is 85% of the complexity of the project. What now is taking place is downscaling, so selecting a few of those, let's call them hotspots, and then understanding what project or projects would reduce or eliminate that given concentration. And that is support of GCF being implemented as we speak. Then the next and third phase will be to apply the methodology across all hotspots with the monumental analytical challenges that will bring from a computational standpoint, analytical, so we don't shy away from acknowledging those. And then once we have that pool of interventions, but each of them really responding to a different composition of economic protection, social protection, ecosystem protection, working very closely with the government of Jamaica, in this case, between the Planning Institute of Jamaica and the Ministry of Finance, to say, okay, what is the prioritization function that will, from this beautiful but massive and heterogeneous pool of projects, how we would rank those? And that is where we want to get to the point where we deliver the national investment prioritization tool, where we can prove to Minister Clark to say, yes, we can assure you that every unit of fiscal effort here is the most effective in protecting value. If we achieve that, apart from meeting the needs and expectations, you open the door for massive opportunities in attracting capital. So, Ecoswahi and many here representing insurance and risk transfer, the potential of taking that portfolio and then exploring combination of risk transfer, risk sharing, capital, concessional is simply monumental, and that is where you generate the fiscal space to the government. That is where you deliver the value that is expected, and the beauty is that then you can integrate the asset level, so delivering again to both. So really exciting, really grateful for the incredible work of Jim and the team and UK government, GCF. It's been a collective effort, and we are working on now seven other countries where an evolution is being brought to the table. Thank you.
Very good. Excellent example. So I'll open it up to questions from the audience. Anybody have a question? Sure.
Hi, I'm Mari Tai. I'm from the National Center of Atmospheric Research and past chair of the American Society of Civil Engineers Committee on Adaptation to Changing Climate. I just wondered, how do we start the conversations that we need to have between investors and insurers and the practicing engineers to make sure that that information is embedded in the design codes and standards and other guidance documents, so that it's not just an ad hoc project by project basis where we're considering the future climate risks, but that all engineers are supported and able to just make sure that their buildings, their infrastructure are going in without having to add to the burden of the other decisions they're already making.
Well, I'll start. And if you're not already connected to the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, they have an action track on standards, tools and standards, that is evaluating exactly this topic from an engineering-centric perspective. But maybe I'll open it up. Anybody want to take it?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for the question. And if you allow me for a little bit of a plug, and again, many parties here involved, both the work at the sovereign level, so the one showcased in Jamaica, but if I dare to say, mainly the work at the asset level has showcased that multidisciplinary collaboration towards a more comprehensive and, let's call it, holistic approach to valuation. And that is where we have brought together 35 institutions ranging from engineering, climate risk data providers, insurance, pension funds, asset managers, banks, rating agencies, multilaterals, and standards. And what we have done is to bring 5 real investments or with the full cash flow models, the full engineering studies, and then started that articulation of the multidisciplinary approach. So starting with the wonderful support of climate risk data providers in advancing pro bono assessments of risk for that selected investment, and then starting a little bit of a value chain that we started thinking it would be very linear, but it was a beautiful feedback loop, and they need to go back and forth, but effectively from climate risk data to CapEx, OpEx, depreciation. From there to potential changes in simulated credit quality adjustments. Then from there to cost of capital, and then the final configuration of the asset. So with that, what we have, and we here, is a very unique experience in that interdisciplinary learning, so that it is not only engineering standards, it is not only climate risk data assessment per se, it is not only asset valuation, or it's not only simulated credit quality, it's a combination of all of the above that is absolutely crucial. And for example, here, the role of risk transfer is where I would dare to say is most exciting, because what we are doing is working with leading insurance firms that they are articulating a new role. So we are pushing the envelope to say, instead of, let's say, deploying off-the-shelf approaches or techniques or instruments, how can you enhance net present value? How can you enhance the value of that and the design of the asset in the total duration? It's really challenging, and I think that Ekoswehi can speak of that, and many here, of the complexity of having a probabilistic assessment for 20 years. It's simply not possible, but just getting us there is really bringing that multidisciplinary learning, but I cannot agree more. This cannot be not siloed, but compartmentalized. It needs to be a little bit of all together. But I stop there. Thank you.
I don't think it's a straightforward, easy one. I think it's a journey, right? And it's with different communities, and it's at different levels, right? We have to keep pushing at a global level in terms of the importance of resilience and the demonstration of the kinds of tools to make that case, right? But we also have to push at a national level, right? Because you can have great tools, but there are political decisions that need to be made, right? And it's often really challenging. You know, when Amit talked about the massive urbanization that is taking place in many developing countries, there's a housing need for people, right? How do you enforce? You need to enforce building codes, but there are political implications associated with that, right? So I think that to address your question, it's complex, it's long-term, it's tackling it at multiple different levels, and it's multidisciplinary. It's a combination of tools, but it's also political, right? It's also the ability to tell a story. It's the ability to communicate the value of the technical skills that you bring to the political discussion that is taking place. And that's kind of why I think this space is exciting, and also the value of what we are doing as a coalition in terms of the thinking around, let's take away insurance, ex-ante thinking, right? Is to have a multidisciplinary conversation around risk. What does it mean in terms of exposure? What does it mean in terms of vulnerability? And then the political conversation of what are the trade-offs, right? And that's not a straightforward answer, unfortunately.
And I'll add one more element to that, which I touched upon slightly earlier, which is really starting to train the next generation not to look at the problem only from one perspective. So I think this multidisciplinary issue is really important because, you know, I've experienced this. I worked on a flood management project, and a brilliant hydrologist knew how to understand the hydrology of the place, and a brilliant ecologist had designed a wetland park, except that the hydrologist had not taken the flood mitigation potential of the wetland park in his calculations, right? So it actually boils down to people on the ground, because end of the day, it's people on the ground who are designing these cities, who are designing the infrastructure, who need to be taught and who need to understand that there's not only one way to solve a problem, right? So when we talk about codes, if the code is saying build a hard infrastructure or this infrastructure for solving a 100-year flood risk. Maybe we need to rethink, and we need to say, the performance of that, whatever you design, has to protect communities. And then let people on the ground try to understand how to solve it. And I think we have to rethink a lot of our systems which need improvement, because we have the opportunity. I mean, the opportunity is there. I've gone to parts of the world where I've met young people, brilliant, committed to changing their societies, but they're missing how to do it. They're missing the understanding of that complexity. So we are focusing a lot, CDRI is focusing a lot on building curriculum that is multidisciplinary, that brings social scientists together with the engineers, helping to frame the problem appropriately. So we are spending a lot of time, how do we get the next generation ready for these questions that are going to keep coming back?
I'll chime in quickly and just say that it's not just one service industry. I think that question cuts across the range of professional services. So as a lawyer, I see that same question aligning with lawyers who tend to talk in essentially an echo chamber. So being able to take that multidisciplinary approach, being able to ensure that you're gaining best of breed insights from your particular discipline, and then seeing where we can apply those across others. At least from our precision, we're using our convening power to really bring together innovative thinkers, to talk through in comfortable settings what some of those solutions practically look like, and then being able to actualize that under a framework of understanding the strategic transformations that are necessary, some of the things like reskilling, enabling the green-collar workforce of the future. How do you sustainably manage the range of capitals that might be impact? So this is human, social, environmental. Where's the role of innovation and technology for your particular organization or your government in actualizing some of these benefits? How are you enabling resilience and transparency in the work that you're doing? And then, of course, how are you financing and regulating this future that you're looking to actualize? Being able to have these types of practical conversations, gaining insights from across industry, across geographies, and then understanding that insight in relation to the overall legal architecture, that is what really manifests the enabling environment for funds to flow. My colleague uses a great reservoir metaphor. We've built up the reservoir, but we can now either let the reservoir flood the fields, or we dig the appropriate channels to ensure that the funds flow to the locations that are most needed. I think that is really the impetus for our role as professional services, is being able to leverage our convening power, bring together the right innovative thinkers, bring together the innovators and those who are acting in a visionary manner, and ensuring that what we're doing is shifting what is a lot of talk into more practical action.
Very eloquent and inspirational way to wrap us up, Freedom Kai. So we're at time. So yeah, thank you everybody, and thank you the panel. And since we started a little late, if people want to ask questions after we finish the formal session, I'm sure everybody would be happy to answer more questions. So thank you.